This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
It's a great question. I believe this is episode 69. Yeah, I think I went back into our megaphone here and I can look and see. So I believe this is, last week was the 68 was last week. The murder of Jared Whaley. The one that you and I did, Satsi Sanchez, was 65. Then we did Molly Olgin, 66. Bruce Weinstein, 67. Jared Whaley, 68. So this is 69. And today's episode, hello, everyone. I guess I should say that. Hi.
Hello.
Welcome to Death by Southwest. And if you are new here, we do our intro the day before. So it's now Tuesday. Our intro came out yesterday, and it has nothing to do with this episode. It's just us chit-chatting and catching up. And we don't really do a sense of place anymore. We have not had an episode in the place where this is today, which is called Kerrville, Texas. And Kerrville is known for its charm and safety. It's about 60 miles west of San Antonio. It has a real feel of a small town, lots of retirees. The population is around 23,000 people. It's known for its rolling hills and picturesque landscapes and the Guadalupe River that runs through it. A lot of little folk festivals and ranches, things like that. Very, very, very low crime rate. So minor burglaries, and even those are once a year. It's a never lock your door type place.
Until this comes out.
Until this, right. And this was a while ago. So our story today takes place in 1992. Which is really interesting, I think, to do some that take place back then versus some that we do that have been much more recent, because the
technology has shifted quite a bit.
So much. I mean, the whole process of investigating a crime and finding people is...
Well, yeah, and people didn't have cell phones in 92, so you can't track them.
Right. I mean, Mark said something once that still sticks with me, that was back in the 80s and before, or even early 90s and before, you just had to drive faster than the cops and get away from them and get out of town to get away with it, which kind of makes sense. So we're going to start on March 30th, 1992, when 911 gets a call from a man who says that his neighbor's maid came over and knocked on his door and said there are the three neighbors are laying in the front hall and they're dead. And 911 says, wait, how many people? And he says 3. I think one of them is around in their 80s, one's in their 70s, and one's in their 50s. And so officers were dispatched immediately to the scene. They arrived to this house, and Margaret Duran was the maid. So she was there. She worked for the family. She said I have a key. When I opened the door to come in today to clean, I immediately saw the bodies on the floor and went next door. So Rusty Herholzer, he's a retired Kerr County sheriff. He says, quote, "We started to do a walkthrough of the house and the crime scene, and this was by far one of the most gruesome scenes I've seen." And sometimes there's not a lot of images available for a lot of these stories. This one had a lot of images and a lot of video footage, actually, for 1992. And
from where?
From I don't know if the police took it or from news stories, but
news stories, sure, but who got the footage that ended up on the news story, or where's it from? In the home, dead bodies.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so cops or investigators or first people on the scene, whatever.
Yeah. So right when you walk in the front door, there's a man and a woman laying face down. They're very close, but kind of in opposite directions. And there was so much blood. So much blood. And so initially officers are just kind of walking in and observing, and it looks like these people have been seriously beaten, possibly stabbed. As they continue into the house, it looks like this probably happened during dinner. There was a bloody knife lying on a table in the foyer. It had blood on it. And as police walked into the living room, they found a deceased older woman sitting in kind of like a lazy boy chair. She had a TV tray over her lap. And it looked like she had been killed mid-meal. There was a bowl
there was a meal.
There was a bowl of beans, a bowl of kind of leftover salad. It had been mostly eaten. She still had a spoon in her hand, and she was just sitting there. Her throat had been slashed. And this is a direct quote that Rusty, the sheriff, said, her head had been bashed in all the way down to the bridge of her nose.
So like this part.
Yeah.
But wow, that's interesting. It must have just locked her hand somehow, kind of locked
into the spoon.
Mm-hmm.
So an elderly man, a middle-aged female were in the foyer, and an elderly female in the living room.
What does elderly mean to you?
I
heard something the other day, and someone called someone in their mid-50s elderly, and my ears went, is that elderly?
Oh, I would say like in their mid-70s.
Yeah, I just don't know. Yeah. I know who I would look at and say, oh, they're elderly or not. But that's just based on looks. Is there like a definitive thing?
As you say that, I'm thinking, I don't know if elderly necessarily has to refer to a number. I feel like elderly has to refer to like, how well do you get around? Like if you're 80...
I thought, I don't know.
80's elderly though.
Well, 80 is elderly, whether you get around.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, in my mind, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's why I'm asking. I was thinking, is elderly when you're past middle age?
Yes, I would think. But
like middle age is to 50, maybe. So maybe 55 could be. Anyways, it doesn't matter. But that's a thought of mine.
I don't want to think about it because I'll soon be.
Well, you're middle aged.
I am.
Well, so am I, pretty much.
Yeah, close. Let us know your thoughts on that, whoever's listening.
Sorry for that derailment.
No, that's okay. It's a good question. So as they continue through the house, they get into the dining room, and it appeared that two people had been sitting eating dinner. So they're assuming the male and female in the front foyer had been eating dinner in the dining room. The elderly woman in the chair was eating dinner in her chair because there were two place settings with beans and salad and whatnot at the table. As they walk through the rest of the house, they see a large purse in the kitchen that had been kind of dumped out. The contents were scattered on the counter and on the floor. There was a kitchen drawer open that looked like some knives had been taken out, moved around. So the cops are thinking these knives look kind of similar. You know, they're not touching anything at this point. CSI isn't there. They're thinking, okay, the knife in the front kind of looks like these. So maybe it came from the house. And so they go through the house and then into the back of the house. As they're going through the house, they see blood on the carpet. There are also shoe prints on the carpet that lead through the house to the back door and out the back door. And
shoe prints, like mud shoe prints, or just impressions in the thick carpet?
Mud and blood, I believe. Okay. And so they follow the shoe prints out the back door. And they also noticed on the floor a lot of cedar bark. Like there was little bark, like scraps of bark all over. Okay. So they follow the shoe prints out to the back of the house, and they find very distinct car tracks. So I believe, if what I saw is correct, that the driveway kind of goes to the side of the house and around to the back almost. And so there was and the back was grass, kind of muddy, and then there was woods behind the house. But in this grassy, muddy part of the kind of where the driveway ends, the yard begins, there are deep and distinct car tracks.
Distinct in the way that these are car tracks, not distinct as in these are these kind of tires or this kind of car.
Well, they don't know that just from looking at it, but
it's obviously a car, not a tractor.
Right. It's a car, not a tractor, not a bicycle.
Got it.
And they're thinking, okay, good. Well, we'll be able to get an imprint from these tire tracks and then be able to figure out what kind of car it is.
Well, or figure out what kind of tires they have.
That's right. Good. Yeah. Good distinction. Very good distinction. That's right. So near the car tracks, they start going from the car tracks and then kind of working their way into the surrounding forest and woodsy area. They find a couple of gloves. One's in a tree, one's on the ground. Both appear to have blood on them. They found a silver spoon on the ground, and it was like real silver and looked like it was a collectible and I saw it. There's like lots of etchings on it, like designs, and there's a word that I couldn't make out, but it looks like a very specific type of silver spoon, not just like a spoon you buy at Target. So they go a bit further into the woods behind all of this, and they find what looks like a club. It's about 2.5 inches wide and 3 feet long. It looks, it's just like a Fred Flintstone club, basically.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Essentially it doesn't look like anybody carved it into a club. It just looks like a big, perfectly.
It just is a club.
Exactly. And they see some blood and hair on it. And they notice that on the side of the house, there's a huge pile of chopped cedar wood, firewood. So initial connections that they're making are, so they took a knife out of the kitchen and they probably took a piece of wood from this wood pile, which indicates that this was potentially not very well planned out. If they came to this house without any weapons, they picked up the weapons on their way into the house, but it's a very brutal, it's a massacre of 3 people. So what was interesting is that cedar wood, apparently in this part of Texas, is a unique type of wood. It has a really stringy bark that can easily be kind of peeled off or can fall off, and that's what they were seeing in the house. But when the bark comes off of this cedar, there's a very slick, smooth wood underneath. So they're hoping maybe we can get a fingerprint off of this. So they talked to the maid after they made their way through the house, Margaret Duran, and she said that the older gentleman in the foyer was Clayton Kenney, 83 years old. The older woman in the chair with the TV tray is Juliana Kenney, his wife, and she's 75 years old. And the woman in the front entryway with Clayton was Adrienne Arnott. She's 44 years old, and she was Mrs. Kenney's only daughter.
Okay. Not daughter together, though.
Not daughter together. So I don't have much on any of them, but just briefly, Clayton Kenney was 83. He's a retired businessman. Juliana Kenney was 75. She was a retired teacher. She was partially paralyzed. In the 1980s, she had a stroke that left her completely paralyzed on her left side. So for many years, she was in and out of nursing homes because it was tough for him to care for her at his age. It became so difficult that eventually Adrienne, Juliana's daughter, she was living in Houston and working as a real estate agent. She semi-retired from that and moved to Kerrville to help take care of her mom. So the Kenneys were living in Kerrville to enjoy their retirement years. The Margaret Duran, the maid, told police how nice and sweet the couple was. They basically kept to themselves. Adrienne was a little more outspoken, she said, but Mr. and Mrs. Kenney were just really good people, members of the Episcopal Church in town, well respected, and they just enjoyed being at their home and living life together. So after the initial walkthrough in the house, the police took Margaret Duran back through the house to see if she could identify if anything was missing, the maid. And she did. So she said Mrs. Kenney had several spoon collections that were apparently pretty valuable. And those were all missing. She also pointed out a few small trinkets that may or may not have been valuable. A brass horse figurine, a brass egg. She did confirm that the knife in the foyer was missing from the kitchen. She said the purse in the kitchen belonged to Adrienne. And I guess she also identified that Mr. Kenney's wallet was missing.
It's interesting that the spoon, whether or not whoever committed this murder or these murders came in with the intention of murdering or not. Did they come in with the intention of stealing
Silver
collectible spoons?
Right. I mean,
Maybe.
perhaps, but
And
then
maybe it went
But that would tell you
terribly
that they must know this family and know that they have that,
Sure.
right? Because like, if
Sure,
you're just
but they
breaking
could have
into a random
But they could have
house-
known the family. That still would speak to they weren't planning on murdering the family. Maybe
Sure.
something
Sure,
went
sure.
wrong.
right?
So
Absolutely,
still could have been not premeditated.
totally.
Yeah.
So, but that is literally the cop's next question. Like, okay, they didn't seem to steal very much. Like, they took some trinkets and a wallet, and this is a very, very aggressive and angry, brutal triple murder to just take like a spoon collection is what it seems like, is what their initial thoughts are, at least. So they continue examining the scene more closely. Again, because the knife and the cedar club were from the scene, it points to exactly what you just said, that maybe something went wrong, because maybe they went there just to rob this home. Because if they were going there with the intent to murder, you'd assume they'd bring weapons, their own weapons, right? Like, I'm not going to show up at a house. I'm not going to show up at a house to murder someone, period. But if I was, I'm not going to show up and hope that I find a murder weapon on the property.
Yeah.
No?
I mean, yeah. No, yes. Correct. I'm just deeper thinking.
Okay. So, police are also thinking this is overkill. Like, this is not just murder. They beat these people senseless and slit Juliana's throat and stabbed them several times, all of them.
What was the daughter's name?
Adrian.
Adrian. So the two older individuals, the couple, it's like, yeah, why did they have to smash their faces in?
Well, right. They slit her throat.
Right. She had a half stroke. She struggled to,
Move on her own.
do daily tasks on her own. So there's something else going on.
There's something very aggressive there. So,
well, you know what's going on.
I
So
do.
Don't say it.
I do. So based on the scene, they believe the murders occurred Sunday evening, the day before. This was Monday now, between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. And this was largely based on the fact that they were all still eating dinner when this happened. And this really stuck with me, really sad observation, grim observation that the cops made was that because Juliana Kenney was paralyzed on her left side, she really couldn't move without assistance, that she likely had to sit in the chair and do nothing as her husband and daughter were brutally murdered in front of her, knowing that she was probably next. And yeah, that would have been a really horrible last moments of life.
I get people who have strokes have different levels or spectrums of mobility.
Right.
I'm guessing she could
really move on her own.
Oh, well, then where was the wheelchair? Where was the walker? Right? Like, I get she couldn't function fully on her own. She had to have 24-hour care, perhaps. But
yes.
You know what I mean? Like,
and there may have been, you know what? I didn't see any mention of a walker or wheelchair, but maybe that's why the daughter was there, that she helped her mom out of the chair. I think she could move. She couldn't stand up and walk on her own.
Well, yeah, because one side of her body.
Right. So that, I mean, I really sat and thought about that. I wish I hadn't, because what a terrible last moments of life. I don't know if there's ever good last moments of life, but
oh, I'm certain there are way better than that if that's what occurred.
Better. Yeah. So that's what they're assuming occurred. As they continued to process the scene, they identified blood spatter on the front door, but they did not see any forced entry. So what they were assuming is either the person knew the family had a key and let themselves in, or knocked on the door, which is kind of what seemed more likely, because both Mr. Kenney and Adrian were in the front. That's where they were killed. So it seemed more likely someone knocked on the door, they answered the door, and then were killed. The cops also felt that based on this, it'd be really hard for one person to do all this without someone escaping or fighting back.
That's true.
Or some real signs of a struggle, which I guess the blood didn't indicate.
Yeah. And going with what you said, if the mother couldn't get up,
right?
It's really, but still two people.
Still two people.
Yeah.
One person coming in.
So there's more than one.
So they're assuming it's more than one person they're looking for. So they start interviewing neighbors around. They interview a man named Mr. Abernathy who lived close by and knew the Kenneys pretty well.
How close do you think?
I believe 1 or 2 doors down.
So not like a mile away.
No. Yeah, close enough. Close. Like in very close.
You can scream and someone would hear you.
Probably.
They're not like in the middle of rural nothingness. Okay.
So Mr. Abernathy said, they were asking him like, do you know of any enemies or anybody who might want to do this? He said, well, Mr. Kenney did complain to me about a nurse's aide who they had hired to live in the home and take care of Mrs. Kenney, named Daniel Diaz. And apparently Mr. Diaz had been abusive to Mrs. Kenney, called her terrible names, was just very rough with her, did not treat her well. And did it so Adrian and Clayton didn't necessarily see it all the time. But Mrs. Kenney was very vocal about the fact that he was doing this and she wanted him fired. So Adrian fired him. So police thought, well, okay, that could create maybe he has a grudge. He had also obviously already exhibited somewhat violent behavior with her, being very rough with her, not...
Shitty behavior.
Shitty, abusive behavior. And there wasn't a lot of details, but abusive behavior.
This is going to make me feel extra sad. Yeah, I'll say it. Extra sad.
So Mr. Abernathy said that 2 months before the murders, but it was after Daniel Diaz had been fired, Daniel showed up to the Kenney house and just walked inside. He was very drunk. He was knocking things over, breaking them. He somehow managed to break Mr. Kenney's hearing aid, and the Kenneys had to call the cops. They had to remove him from the scene and whatnot. So police are obviously very interested to talk to this Daniel Diaz right away. So they send some officers to go and try and find him. And while they're waiting to talk to or find Daniel Diaz, Margaret Duran, the maid, helped the cops locate the deed to the house, the wills, all kind of the important paperwork so that they could try to see if there were other relatives that they could get in touch with. And they discovered that Clayton Kenney had a son, not with Juliana, from someone else, Brian Kenney, who lived in Georgia. They found his number, they made the call, and they broke the news to Brian that, his father, stepmother, and stepsister had been murdered. He said he would fly in right away. And kind of just as when, we've had so many episodes where it's a couple and one person murders the other, and that it's, no secret that often in situations when someone's murdered and they're in a marriage, relationship, whatnot, police tend to look to the partner first. And so similarly to that, they're looking to, because both partners are murdered, they're looking to other family members.
They're going to look into anyone they can locate that had contact or had a relationship with these people at this point.
Exactly. So they're anxious to talk to Brian. They obviously can't interview him right away because he has to get into town. But they did start looking a little bit more into kind of the family finances, things like that. And they noticed that Mr. Kenney had redone his will several months before he was murdered. And the sole person to get any and everything from the estate would be Brian. And it wasn't, we're not talking millions, but the property was worth around $300,000. And this is back in 1992. So pretty good. The Kenneys had pretty significant savings. I couldn't find the exact amount, but it was supposedly enough to keep them very comfortable. They had safety deposit box, stocks and bonds. They
had retirement accounts.
Yeah, they were living comfortably. And so, again, several months prior to these murders, the will now said, who knows what it said before, but the will had been amended to say that Brian would receive everything. So now they kind of have another suspect in their mind. Did he do this for financial gain?
I don't think so, but I've been wrong a lot lately. So,
well, the thing that struck me the most is he could have hired someone, but he's in Atlanta right now, flying in, at least as far as they know.
I got to say something.
What?
When you say that lets me know he didn't hire someone, because you know how the story ends.
I do.
So stop saying stuff like that.
Okay. So now cops have 2 suspects, Danny Diaz and Brian Kenney. They each have different motives, either revenge for Danny or financial gain for Brian. And they also need to eliminate another person that they haven't eliminated yet. Do you know who that is?
The housekeeper, the maid?
Yeah, the maid. So they talked to Margaret and her husband. They were together during the times of the murders, but they want to further check it. So they asked them both to take a polygraph. Both pass. They also checked Margaret and her husband's cars to see if their tires were a match to the tire tracks at the scene. They were not. So they were eliminated as suspects.
And I bet at this point, it's fine if it didn't say what it was, but I bet at this point they know or could have known what type of tires. Bridgestone, Firestone, Michelin.
Well, even
blah, blah, blah.
And even if they do, and actually I'll tell you right now, I don't know what the type of tires were. That is
also,
never indicated. But
guess what? It doesn't matter because there's 5-7 major types.
Right. Well, and they have the image of the tire tracks, and so they can hold it up to someone's tires and be like, this matches, this doesn't. So they do a background check on Danny Diaz while they're locating him. He does have a criminal record and a history of abusing women. They found out that he lived south of Kerrville in a mobile home. So they went to interview him, and they inform him that the Kenneys have been killed. He immediately says, I know nothing about this. He says, I did work for them, but I left on good terms with them, which police know is a lie. They ask if he has an alibi. He says he worked the day of the murders, and then he went to his girlfriend's house afterwards from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. They say, okay, can we search your residence?
Where did he work? I'm guessing they checked that out too. Was he actually at work?
They were going to check that out. Yeah. At this point, he's telling them this. And so they said, can we search your house? Okay, we'll check your alibi.
Okay.
Can we search your house? And he says, sure. So they're looking for a shoe that could maybe match the tracks at the scene, any of the missing trinkets, things like that. They discover that he has a motorcycle and not a car. So the tire tracks weren't a match. And they didn't really have anything else. So there wasn't enough to arrest him at this point. So they asked for his girlfriend's address, went to his girlfriend Kelly Brown's house, interviewed her to see what she would say. She verified his alibi. She did raise a few red flags. She said, yeah, I was with him. He was here, but he came into the house and he washed his hands all the way up to his elbows, and he wasn't wearing his motorcycle gloves, which he almost always is when he gets home.
So maybe he wasn't on his motorcycle.
So they go back to Danny and they say, will you take a polygraph? He said, sure. Now, a polygraph is not admissible in court, but what I thought was interesting that they explained is that it's a really good tool because if someone fails it, they often become kind of nervous and they're more likely to confess.
It's something. It's not going to prove you guilty or non-guilty. It's not going to be the end-all, be-all.
Right.
What it's going to do is help your defense or help the opposition or whatever.
Yep. So he agreed. Danny agreed. He took the test, and they asked him point blank, did you murder the Kenney family? And he said, no, I did not. And he failed the polygraph. They also polygraphed Kelly Brown, his girlfriend, asked her similar questions, asked if Danny killed the Kenney family. She failed as well, the polygraph. So officers at this point are like ready to arrest them both, but Ron L. Sutton, the former DA at the time, said, no. In this situation, even though they both failed the polygraph, this is not enough. We don't have really any physical evidence to indicate that he had anything to do with it. So we need to just kind of put a pin in him for right now. That's it. Now he was at work. That alibi checked out. But the only alibi he has for the time of the murders is his girlfriend. They both failed the polygraph test. So it's, they don't really know what to think. So they decide to turn their attention to Brian Kenney, who just flew in from Georgia. Brian said there's the son, Clayton Kenney's son. Brian said, they interviewed him. He said, there's no really issues between me and my dad or me and my stepmom or me and my stepsister. I mean, me and my dad are not especially close, but we don't have any problems. And he had an alibi. He was in Atlanta at the time, which of course they had to verify. But if it's true, it's a pretty good alibi. But what struck police about Brian is that when he spoke to them, he was really calm. Like his entire family had just been murdered.
And he said he wasn't that close to them.
He did. But they, between like his kind of eerie calmness and the financial gain that he could have had from this, they asked him to take a polygraph. And he passed. And they
Meaning they asked him, did you murder your father?
Yes, and he said no, and he passed. And they verified that he was in Georgia at the time. So he was eliminated, outside of any additional evidence turning up. He's not the one.
For now, at least.
For now. So the next afternoon, Kelly Brown, Danny Diaz's girlfriend, calls the police. And she says, all right, I wasn't totally honest with you guys. She says, Danny actually confessed to me. He came in and he told me he murdered them, and he asked me to be his alibi. So police are like, okay, well, great. Then he's now our prime suspect. So they ask Kelly, will you call him and try to get him to admit it on the phone? And she says, okay. So she calls him and she says, you know how you told me about killing them, right? And he immediately loses his shit. He's like, you're lying. I never said that to you. That's not true. Blah, blah, and then hangs up on her. So this gets them nowhere. And so Kelly's still sitting there at the police station, and they're kind of trying to figure out, okay, what's our next move? And she says, you know what? Okay, he didn't specifically tell me that he murdered them. And police are like,
She keeps kind of
flip-flopping her story.
I'm not saying she's wrong, but like,
right.
If you're going to come back around with the full thing.
Police are like, this is not, we have to eliminate her as a witness. She's unreliable at this point. This is not going to work. Like, duh. She's now flip-flopped her story. So meanwhile, during all of this investigating, the 3 funerals were conducted. And police thought this might not only be an opportunity to see kind of who attended the funeral, because, oftentimes someone who murders somebody will attend their funeral. So they thought, we'd like to go and kind of see who's there. They also had a ton of police come and every policeman had a copy of the tire tracks. And they had the police going from car to car in the parking lot, seeing if they could find a car that matched these tires that match these tire tracks.
Unless it's a I get like Firestone makes different kind of tires, but like myself, it's not because we all have Toyotas, but myself, Mark, and Michael all have the same tires. Obviously, it's because we know each other and they think it's the best tire, but still, like, there's not all that many kinds, right?
I think there's a lot of kinds. I have 2 different types of tires on my car.
Right, but let's think of umbrellas.
I think like Firestone makes a bunch of different tires.
But
each tire has a very specific tread.
Okay, so like within Firestone, you're saying there's 10. Within
within
Bridgestone, there's
Pirelli,
10.
Within so like all these different types of there's not. I agree with you. I think you're right. There's a limited amount of brands of tires, but I think within those brands there's variations, just like Nike has 85 billion different ones.
I also think for regular cars, there's only so many sizes, 14 or 16 inch that you can. So sure, they make a range, but within the general public of the cars that people are driving, assuming maybe half of those.
Also, we're in I actually don't think I was going to say we're in a small town. There's like I'm assuming there's no like Ferraris and Porsches, but that's kind of, why would I assume that? That's not necessarily true.
But same could be said for Ferrari and Porsche. It's
specific
14,
cars.
16.
Right. But I think that I actually don't know. So we'll have to look into it. But so they are going from car to car, seeing if the tread on any of these tires match the tread at the scene. Not one car in the parking lot at the church matched. So after the funeral ends, the cops kind of stay behind and start talking to friends and family of the Kenneys, seeing if they can gather any more information, because they're kind of at a standstill now. So Adrian has a bunch of friends from Houston that had come up to the funeral, and they, through conversation, found out that Adrian had been in a relationship prior to moving here. And not just a relationship, he had in fact been engaged to a Ronald Thompson. And before she moved, her and Ronald had some type of disagreement, called off the engagement, broken up, and then Adrian had left. But Adrian's friend said he was very jealous. There was a lot of problems throughout the relationship. He spent a lot of her money. He potentially had a drinking problem. There was possibly some various abuse. So cops now thought, okay, I don't know, like would he travel all the way here and kill her and her whole family because of a disagreement and breaking up? And so they asked her friends directly. They said, do you think that Ronald is capable of doing this? Like something so heinous, killing 3 people very violently. And every single friend said yes.
It's kind of, this is maybe what you said earlier. Like, this kind of reminds me of something we might talk about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So now Ronald Thompson is on their radar, is a suspect, and they want to interview him. So while they're trying to locate him, they're looking into his past, and one way or another, they discover that he's been to Kerrville several times in the past. About a week later, they find him in Lubbock, Texas. He says he has an alibi. He was with his new girlfriend in Lubbock the night of the murders. They said, can we give you a polygraph? He said, yeah, at a later date. I'm not going to come in. I'm not going to drive all the way to you and like take a polygraph right now. They asked to interview the girlfriend. She says, yes, Ronald was with me during the time of those murders. Cop's like, okay, well, we'd like you to come in as soon as you can, take a polygraph, whatnot.
Both of them.
Yeah.
They're really, I guess 92 had to rely. I mean, I've never, obviously polygraphs still exist.
No, never this much.
But I've never heard you say it every other potential witness.
Yep.
Or, potential suspect.
Yep. So several days after these phone calls, Ronald calls the cops and says, I will not be coming in to take a polygraph. I spoke to an attorney. He advised me not to. Police they really can't do anything. They don't have enough evidence to like force him to come in. So they're frustrated, but kind of at a stalemate. So they're like, all right, let's go back. We're not getting anywhere with the tire tracks, not getting anywhere with any of these suspects. So they go back to the muddy, bloody shoe track. So they take the photographs and prints of the shoe. They go to the local J.C. Penney, and they start just comparing it to shoes on the shelf there. And they identified it as a Nike Air size 9 or 9.5. Okay, well, where do we go from here with this? They're really that doesn't necessarily point. Good to know, but doesn't necessarily point them in any specific direction. We're now 3 weeks into the investigation. So they go back to the lab and they're like, anything. Did you find anything? Like anything, any weird fingerprints, hair, anything? And the lab says we were able to find a teeny tiny partial fingerprint on the club. It was small. It was like the size of your pinky fingernail. So it's not a full fingerprint, but we found one. Cops are like, great. We're going to figure out who it is. So they go back to every suspect. Danny Diaz and his girlfriend, Kelly. Ronald, the ex of Adrian. Brian, the son. They get fingerprints and palm prints from all of them.
None of them match.
None of them match. Police are crushed. And at this point, in my mind, well, go ahead because I can tell you were going to say something.
Well, no, I'm going back to the Nike Air.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Spotify.
A lot of athletic shoes have a female version and a male version.
Mm-hmm. I believe it was male.
Okay.
So at this point, they're at a stalemate for months. And to me, my first thought was, well, what do you mean? You have a fingerprint. Run it through the system.
Well, don't you think they did that?
Well, I found an interesting quote.
Or was there a system in 92?
That's it. So Sheriff Rusty Herholzer says, we didn't have the technology back then.
Right.
So it was a lot of like manual fingerprint work, like
going through
taking all the suspects' fingerprints and comparing it to that. But there wasn't like a huge database in a computer that you could just run a fingerprint through. There was barely computers.
There probably was somewhat of a database on a computer, but it wasn't the technology where you could pop in this
Right.
teeny tiny piece of a print.
Right.
And it'll run through like all the people who there have been archival things on the computer since 85 or 89. Sure.
Right.
But it doesn't have the technology
Technology
to
to
at
identify
it. You
that.
can look at the screen and look at this, but you have to go
Yes.
through however thousands of people in the past 5 years have been arrested and it's
There you go.
been put in the system.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. So nothing's happening. Months and months are going by. We're approaching the year anniversary of these horrible murders, and people in Kerrville are scared because no one's been caught. So this is a town where, like, you leave your doors open, there's maybe a burglary a year. 3 people are brutally murdered in their home, and no one has been caught. So everyone in town is concerned. Like, is this person going to strike again?
Hopefully they're
who is
locking
it?
their doors.
I hope so. So we reach a year after the murder, and Kerrville police are still just like really frustrated with this. So they reach out to San Antonio police, about 60 miles away. And San Antonio police say, well, we'll get our Crime Stoppers organization to see if they can help. So Crime Stoppers, I didn't know exactly what it was, but I guess it's an organization that works with law enforcement, gathers information about crimes, and offers a reward for information about crimes. So in March of 1993, Crime Stoppers aired on Texas TV, asking for info from anyone who knew anything about the Kenney family murders. Several months later, in July of 1993, they get 2 phone calls, 2 tips from this ad that's been airing on TV. And both of these calls identified a man at Kerrville State Hospital who was there seeking treatment for drugs and mental health. His name was James John Steiner. Apparently, while at the hospital where he was a patient, he had told people, specifically one of the employees at the hospital, that he had been part of those murders and he had killed people at the Kenney home. So cops are like, who is this person? They start digging into him. They find his sister and they ask if they can interview her. She says yes. She said, yeah, he's been in and out of hospitals for years because of his drug addiction. He has some mental health issues. He also has some very violent tendencies. And they say, do you think he'd be capable of doing this? She says yes. But cops are still thinking, he couldn't have done this alone. So they ask her, does he have any friends or girlfriends, boyfriend, anything that could have done this, could have been involved in this with him? And she says, well, around that time, a year ago, James was living with Sam Gallimore, one of his good friends. They were living in Kerrville at the time of the murders. Rusty, the investigator that I've mentioned, knew Sam Gallimore since he was probably 8 or 9 years old. Sam grew up in a small community slightly east of Kerrville called Center Point. Rusty knew him, knew his family for, 20 years at this point. He said, Rusty, the sheriff said, Sam had a few drug charges, a minor disorderly conduct, but he was a petty criminal. He just couldn't believe that he would have any part in such a horrific kind of murder. They also couldn't figure out what the connection was. So they're pressing James Steiner's sister. And she says, well, the only thing I can think of besides the fact that they were living in Kerrville is that James was working at a nursing home called Edgewater when he lived in Kerrville. So police look into Edgewater and they discovered that at the time that James was working at Edgewater, Mrs. Kenney was a patient at Edgewater and he helped to take care of her at the nursing home. But they were like, this is the only connection. She was living at the nursing home, so they couldn't.
I mean, to me, there's not a firm connection, but that's a big connection.
It is a big connection.
Because there's so many things that just on the surface, okay, that's a connection. But if she was there 6 months, a year, even a month, so many things could have perspired.
Yes. That
you can't even kind of fathom. And I'm not even talking about big, huge things, just things.
So the next day, they're kind of cogitating on this. The next day, they find out through employment paperwork that they had requested that at one point, Mr. Kenney had hired James to come take care of Mrs. Kenney in their home for a weekend. This weekend occurred a year before the murders. So now they can put James Steiner at the Kenney home. But same as always, their question is, what's the motive? He had been hired for a weekend to be there and help her. And then a year later, he comes back and kills the whole family. James' sister has no idea. She says, I really don't know. But the only other person who might know something would be Sam's girlfriend at the time. He had a girlfriend. So maybe she knows something. They said, okay, can you invite her over here? Do you still know her? And she said, yeah, I'll call her. So Sam's girlfriend came over to James's sister's house and they interviewed her. And in the interview, she said back then, Sam and James would use her car a lot. They didn't have their own, so they would borrow hers. So they said, well, can we take a look at your car? Yeah, they do. And the tire tracks on her car match the tire tracks found at the scene. So then they get a hold of the lab and they ask them to pull, now they can specifically ask them to pull Sam Gallamore's fingerprints because he did have some petty crime in the past. So his fingerprints are on record, but you're 100% right that they couldn't just like run it through and match it. So they had to pull his specific fingerprints and
because
compare
now they
it.
can look up his name in the system.
Right. And
they're
pull
not
the
having to labor through the
Hundreds,
pages. Yeah.
Exactly. So they pulled his fingerprints, compared it to the print from the Cedar Club, and it matched. It was his left index finger. So cops are like, finally.
What's an index finger? Your pointer?
Yeah.
Oh, he's got but not a tiny one. It just had a tiny part of the
partial,
bit.
yeah.
Okay.
So cops are ecstatic. They said, where is he? Where can we find him? And Sam's girlfriend currently or ex-girlfriend, I believe, said, well, he's been living with his aunt in Indianapolis. Okay. So the cops find the aunt in Indianapolis, interview her. She said, yes, Sam's staying in Niles, a suburb of Chicago, doing some work. He's remodeling a hair salon. So they know that James is in the state mental hospital. So they're like, we're going to not pursue him at the moment. We're going to go after Sam first. So they get on a plane, fly to Chicago, contact the local police in Niles. Local police said, yeah, we'll help. They all go to the beauty shop the next morning. And when detectives arrived at Sam's workplace, this beauty shop where he was helping to remodel, it was like he knew why they were there. Rusty said he walked in, he looked at Sam. Sam looked at him, and Rusty said it was like everything went still for a moment.
Because he did know why they were there.
Sam
if
was
he did it,
up on
I'm
a
assuming.
ladder, and Sam turned and said, hi, Rusty. And Rusty said, hi, Sam, you know why I'm here? And he said, yep. And he climbed down from the ladder. And Rusty said, quote, we arrested him without any issues. I think he was tired of living with what he had done. So after being read his rights, they took him to the Niles Police Department, and Sam provided a comprehensive and detailed confession. He admitted to authorities that him and James had been shooting crank, which is meth, essentially, I believe. When they ran out, they needed money for more.
That's interesting, like shooting meth.
Well, crank, I believe, is a methamphetamine. I don't know if it's...
Is it like crack? Like meth?
Yeah, it's meth.
And
It's speed. Just crystal meth.
Wait, whoa. Oh, crystal meth. It's meth.
Yeah.
Speed.
Yep. All of those things.
Huh?
Yes. And so they were shooting it. And when they ran out, they needed more. And they needed money to get more. So him and James had been were talking about like, well, we got to rob somebody. We have to go rob somebody for money. And James had said, I don't know who. I think the Kenneys probably have a lot of money. I don't know. So very high on the little drugs that they had left, they pulled into the Kenney house driveway around 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. Sam said that, we were pretty drug crazed and we were planning to just rob the house. But we both agreed before we went in, if anything goes wrong, we'll kill everyone. And they were both like, yeah, we'll kill everyone. So Sam found a big club on the way up, gave it to James. James went and hid behind the corner of the house. Sam knocked on the door.
I mean, I wonder what they were thinking. I get they weren't in their wise mind.
They were not.
But like, you probably saw that people were home. Lights were on.
Yeah.
So what did you think? Things weren't going to go quote unquote wrong. You knew you were going to come upon people. So what were you going to do if you didn't want to be identified?
Well, I mean, I guess you could walk in, hit them over the head, knock them out, and not kill them.
That's true.
You know?
But then they're still going to remember you unless you have a mask on.
Yeah, or get a mask.
But did they have a mask?
They did not.
Okay.
So Sam knocked on the door. Mr. Kenney answered the door, and Sam said, "Do you have a jack? My car is up the road and has a flat." And Mr. Kenney was like, No, and went to shut the door. He was like, "I'm not dealing with this." Sam pushed the door in, and James, who was hiding around the corner, came running in with the club. They immediately started beating Mr. Kenney. So, like, nothing per se went wrong. He just was closing the door. They could have still pushed their way in without beating him to death. But they did.
But then he would have seen that. Like, this wasn't a well thought, understandably, not well thought out. Because unless you hit them and make them pass out or kill them.
Or have a mask on.
There's a chance they'll know who you, they'll be able to recall something. Yeah.
So they started beating him. Adrian heard what was going on, ran to the foyer to see what was happening. They knocked her down and beat her to death. Sam said that they both used the club. They just took turns. They also only had one pair of gloves, so they each wore one glove.
Wow.
Sam went into the kitchen while James was beating Adrian and Mr. Kenney with the club. He got a knife out of the kitchen drawer. He said, quote, "I'm not sure if James did any stabbing, but I did." He also said that he was the one who walked into the house while James was continuing to beat Mr. Kenney and Adrian. Sam walked into the house, found Juliana sitting in the chair, and killed her. Slit her throat first, so she would have died, but then proceeded to beat her.
Well, remember, they're not in their wise mind. He doesn't know once you slit someone's throat, they're going to bleed out in 5 seconds or 5 minutes.
So once they had killed everyone, they began looking for things they could sell, looking for money. They grabbed the spoons, grabbed some trinkets. They grabbed Mr. Kenney's wallet, but it only had about $25 in it. So the cop said, "Well, what did you do with the trinkets? Like, were you able to sell them?" And Sam said, "Well, we didn't want to get caught with them. So I actually just put them in a plastic baggie, took them to my parents' property, and buried them in the ground."
Well, and didn't one spoon end up in the middle of the forest?
Yeah, one fell out, yeah.
Also, why didn't they take... Again, I understand they were high and all fucked up and adrenaline and whatever, but they didn't take any TVs or any stereo systems or whatever, electronics.
No, but I guess in 92, a TV would be pretty hard to take. Think about our TV in 92. It was huge.
Yeah, but everyone's dead.
Yeah, that's true. I guess you could have taken the time to carry it out together.
I guess maybe they didn't want to, yeah.
But, so really all they came away with was $25. And they said they bought a bag of marijuana with it. And so the cop said, "So you brutally murdered 3 people for a baggie of pot?" And Sam was like, "Yeah."
And also, that did them no good if they were meth addicts.
Right, of course. So investigators are bringing Sam back to Kerrville while other officers are headed to the state hospital to arrest James. James very quickly wanted to confess. He did. His story matched Sam's. And the next day they took Sam Gallimore to his parents' house to say, show us where you buried everything. And sure enough, he did. And everything was there. The egg, the horse, the spoons, buried in the yard. So the DA was appalled by these crimes, rightfully so. He was like, "These are mindless, unnecessary killings, and I think both of these men should be executed." So he personally sought out the death penalty for these crimes.
I bet James did not get the death penalty.
Sam Gallimore was convicted and got the death penalty. He wrote a handwritten statement that was distributed after his execution that said, "I would like to apologize and say I'm sorry, but words seem so hollow and cheap. Their deaths should not have happened, but it did. I'm so sorry all of this took place." And that was distributed after January 14th, 2003, when he was executed by lethal injection at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. He was 31 years old. I don't know that we've had an episode where someone has actually been executed, have we?
I'm not sure.
I don't think we have.
I
I'm
wonder
not
what
sure
his
either.
last meal was.
Oh, that's right. That was something we've talked about several times.
I mean, I don't really care about him.
No, but it's an
particular,
interesting
but I like a
topic.
last meal conversation.
James Schneider was convicted of capital murder, but he was given life in prison.
Oh, not even a mental institution.
Well, given that he had been in and out of a mental hospital and that his father had been killed at a young age in a motorcycle accident, the jury seemed to kind of take pity on him and believe that there were mitigating circumstances.
Yeah, I bet it was because he came from a mental hospital. I knew he wouldn't get death penalty.
So
also, that could be considered worse for some people.
Absolutely.
He got a worse sentence.
Well, he did, except for the fact that he's serving his life sentence at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice in the Darlington unit in Rosharon, Texas, and he is eligible for parole in 2029. So in 5 years.
Well, let's follow up.
Well, and that's...
You know what I want to know?
Mm-hmm.
James was in the mental hospital or the psych ward or wherever, and he told a behavioral tech or someone there what he did. Where's that person?
True, because they left an anonymous tip with Crime Stoppers.
Oh, they did?
Well, that's how this all started.
Oh, it was anonymous, though.
Yeah, I believe it was two anonymous tips with Crime Stoppers. So nobody knows.
But then how do you know it was them? If it was an anonymous.
Well, they said I'm an employee at the hospital. I believe.
Okay.
I believe.
Okay, well then fine. They did their job, because I was going to say.
Well, yeah, it's illegal, isn't it, to not report that?
Yeah, it's illegal, unethical. It's a many things, but
Many things.
It's just
Let's
many
see.
things.
I'm going back to my notes here to see.
Oh, I must have totally missed that part.
Okay, a year after the murder, they reached out to San Antonio police. They ran something on Texas TV in March of 93. In July of 93, 2 Crime Stopper tips came in. And both of the tips said he admitted to an employee at the Kerrville State Hospital that he had killed people at the Kenney home. So I don't know if it was actually the hospital worker or another employee that knew it. Either way, but it was someone. It was the hospital worker or hospital worker adjacent, a coworker. So, really sad though. I don't know if we've had, this one had a few things that I didn't know if we'd had. One with like a whole family being murdered. I want to say we
have. We've had a couple and a kid, or I don't know.
I think that we had one. The only one I think. No, I was gonna say the mom who got murdered by her son, but I don't think that he got the death penalty. I think he got like 41 years or something. For some reason, that
I don't
sticks out to
find
me.
the death penalty more sad. I don't.
I go back and forth. Because there's no suffering. You don't have to live with what you did anymore. You don't suffer at all. I mean, you're dead, so you cannot live life anymore. But I agree in some ways. And then in other ways, I also think depending on the prison you're in,
sure,
the people you're with, how you handle prison, you can really have a life in prison. Not a great life, not a real life, but you can have you're still talking, eating, socializing. Again, depending, I know everybody has a very different.
I have no idea. I've never been in prison.
Me either.
So I can't presume to say. I think they're both bad.
You think the death penalty might be the easier way out?
I don't know. Depending on what people think about what happens
when you die.
If there's hell or
That's
heaven or nothingness. Or so I just think it's not necessarily worse. Again, depending on the prison and all that.
Yeah.
And how guilty you feel. And if you have loved ones, or maybe you have no one that wants to come see you, and maybe you're alone and you die in there rotting alone, or you get raped. There's a million things, or it could be fine.
I guess I think like the death penalty is very, very final. To me, being in jail, there is some element of suffering happening. If you're never getting out into the normal world again, you're never going to see a woman or man again, have sex again.
So weird that you went to that. Like, what? You're gonna have sex again if you're in prison, whether you want to or not.
Okay, well, right. I guess I mean,
like, that's a weird thing.
Not like sex with someone you love. Well, I guess that's not true. I can't say that either.
There you go.
All right. I'm talking myself into a hole. Well, anyways, I don't, I guess I don't know anybody. Let's start again that. Hopefully we did this story justice. Thoughts are with the Kenney family, extended family, I guess. And, yeah. Any last thoughts?
Plenty, but none I'm going to put on this recording.
All right. Well, thank you guys for listening very much. We would love to see more of your reviews and emails. And again, I was reminded when I looked at that comment today that the comment before that was somebody saying like, I really don't want to have to stop listening because of your political beliefs. Could you keep your politics to yourself? And remember
another one?
No, the same one. Remember we said like, could you write us? Send us a DM, send us an email.
They stopped listening.
No, she said, I don't want to have to stop listening because of your political beliefs.
Right,
so
but did she ever respond to you?
No, not that I've seen. So
well, maybe she stopped listening then.
Maybe she did. But if you didn't, please let us know. I would really like to know.
Also, maybe there's not that much more to know. She just doesn't want to hear our political thoughts.
Right, but but that's what I'm saying.
Yes,
I don't feel like we share them
I said this
much.
last time. Of course, you could go back on that episode, listen back, and you'll hear what she's referring to. I have no idea what it is, but obviously she didn't just pull that out, or they, whoever it is, didn't just like say that out of nowhere. I'm not saying it's all like, I agree, but we must have said something. Yeah.
Which is hard because I was going to ask you about the debate and then I was like, no, I'm not going to ask her.
Do not.
I will not. All right.
Also, you didn't watch it.
I watched parts.
TikTok
on YouTube.
parts?
YouTube parts. I watched enough to know. But we won't go there because we're done with this episode. So thank you guys for listening and we will see you next week.
Good night and good luck.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye. Death by Southwest is hosted by Jenna Schneider and Margot Carmichael.
Executive produced by Margot Carmichael.
Produced by Jenna Schneider.
Audio editing and sound design by Margot Carmichael.
Music by Soundstripe.
And a special thanks to Edward R. Murrow for letting us borrow his famous sign-off phrase, good night and good luck.